welcome in everyone to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. We have a great show for you today. I am your host, as always, Tommy Brzee. It is Monday, May 6th, and tons of stuff happened over the weekend, but I want to start with the House versus the NCAA case, the NIL back pay case that we've been talking about for quite some time. Sounds like it's starting to come to a head. Sounds like there's starting to be some agreements come to, or at least some common ground starting to come to, and we'll get to why that is a good thing in the short term, but creates a lot more questions down the road. But then we'll get into a little bit of talk around bowl games. It seems like there is being an idea kicked around for more bowl games in the future, which is something that I think we'll get some mixed reviews. I'll get into my thoughts about it. I'm kind of mixed on it as well, to be totally honest with you, but we'll see how that kind of plays out. And then we'll get into a transfer portal update. One of the last ones that we'll do around here. It's starting to wind down, tons of commitments starting to roll in, and less big-time names on the table for teams to go after, but still some big-time guys out there. So I want to break down everything for you guys there. And then we have a Good Vibes Monday, and we're going to go back to the College Football 25. Well, it seems like we are getting closer and closer to this game coming out, and closer to that big-time reveal that should be here in about 10 to 11 days. It's kind of fuzzy on when exactly it's coming out, but it seems like it's coming out very, very soon. So we'll get into that towards the end of the show. But before we jump into everything, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show. And the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have a fun back and forth here. Maybe you can ask me something that you've been wondering about. You can call me out on something that I didn't mention during a segment. Anything is welcome. But you can use the tip and donation link at the bottom of the screen, GSMCPodcast.net. Huge help not only to us here at the network, but to you all. You get to kind of watch the show, but not only that, be a part of the show in some ways. So would love to have that. Again, that's GSMCPodcast.net. But let's jump right in, and let's talk about this House versus the NCAA case. There has been so much stuff going on around this case, and it feels like it's starting to kind of come to a head with the settlement agreement that hopefully will be agreed to very, very soon. The NCAA is pushing very, very hard for that, and we'll get to why that exactly is here in a second. But Brandon Marcello over at CBS Sports did a fantastic piece about this, not only giving us an idea of where we sit today, but how this creates, really thousands of questions, to be totally honest with you, about what the future of college football looks like, what the structure will look like, how NIL will be broken down. So let's kind of jump into the questions that he broke down and kind of get you an idea of just where all this sits right now and where it might sit, 5 years down the road. So to start, as we know, this NIL back pay case has been a huge topic of conversation. It looks like the current discussions are sitting somewhere around $1 billion to go back to former athletes, whether it was from being in video games in the past or just missing out on the NIL money that current kids are, encouraged and pushed to take. So I think it could be really interesting to see how this kind of unfolds, because the reality is the NCAA is in a spot where they very much need this to be settled. It's one of those things where when you have a case like this where antitrust laws and things of that nature are brought into play, it sits at like 1.1 billion or something like that. I can't exactly remember the exact number at this very moment, but it sounds like if it were to go to court, those numbers could be tripled or even more to about 4.2 billion. So essentially, this has to get settled because the NCAA just needs it to get settled more than anything else. If they don't get it settled this way, it's going to be essentially the end of the NCAA, even if it's not already, to be totally honest with you. But one of the bigger questions coming out of this was not, what the settlement money was going to be for the NCAA, but how it was going to affect the rest of the colleges in the college football or the college sports world. So this obviously would bring in something along the lines of revenue sharing. And there was a new report from Pete Thamel, I believe, this morning that I want to get to a little bit later that throws a little bit of a wrench into the kind of this type of stuff. But it seems like if you were to go to the revenue sharing route, the amount per year would be between 15 and 25 million, according to some of the athletic directors that were surveyed by 247 Sports over there at CBS. So there's been a ton of things going on around this type of thing, and obviously there's a ton of dominoes that are still yet to fall. I mean, we don't really know what happens after this. How that 25 to 15 or 15 to 25 is allocated. We don't know. Does it go to the athletic department? Is the collective involved at all? So a lot of questions to be answered, but let's get to the one that I think a lot of people are focusing on, which is the salary cap. It feels like something that a lot of people have been pushing for quite some time, but the issue with that is you want there to be a salary cap, right? You want there to be a moniker that the big time teams can't go over, because it just helps the competitive balance of a game that does not do the best of keeping competitive balance as a part of the game. So I think that's something that a lot of people have been pointing towards as a non-negotiable in these discussions. But I think the big question is, will the NIL collectives be included in this conversation at all? Like, will they be brought in-house to the athletic departments? Will they be separate from the athletic departments? The going theory, it seems, around athletic departments and things of that nature is, if the whole 15 to 25 million, if that is entirely put on the athletic departments and they are forced to pay that entire amount without the collective's help, or without alumni help and that type of thing, collectives will still be in place. Because the reality is, you can have a salary cap and that's all well and good, but it could not apply to the NIL part of the world, right? These are looking more like kind of a contract type model, although it might not be. But in the world of where it is a contract type model going forward with employment for players, you still want that outside entity to kind of help you get that competitive advantage. So it'll be really interesting to see if the collectives are kind of grouped in on this. They have to pay a certain amount of the 15 to 25, because then you'd probably bring them in-house, bring them a part of the athletic department, and make it a little bit more of a cohesive type structure, instead of what we have now, which is a little bit all over the place with some different entities that you don't fully understand having quite a bit of power in the sport. So it's a very, very interesting thing. It's something that I think we're going to be watching very, very closely, because if collectives are able to stay around, it doesn't necessarily change the the gap between these teams. Excuse me, I was trying to find my words. The gap between these teams, the competitive balance that you really want to set up in college football, it probably wouldn't do much to subside that if you were to add a salary cap but not include the collectives. So I would expect them to include the collectives in this. I would expect the collectives to be brought in-house into the athletic department and just have it be a little bit more of a crystalline structure around the NIL world. But then the biggest question, I think that, if you're a college football fan, you're probably not too worried about this, but what happens to every other sport? I'm someone who, college football is the top. There's no question about that. I love college football more than I love most things, to be totally honest with you. But I'm a big fan of all college sports. I love college basketball. I love, watching college baseball, get into a ton of different stuff throughout the year, because you identify with their teams, right? You identify with the school that you went to. You identify with the school you grew up being a fan of, so you want to be able to support them year round, and it's something that is hugely important to a number of people. And then you have fans who, played at those schools, whether it was a smaller sport like swimming or equestrian or whatever, that want to be a part of their school going forward and that team going forward. It seems like it's not going to be pretty. And just to give you an idea, I have a quote here from Jason Besler, who is the president of Student NIL, or Student Athlete NIL, excuse me. And I think it gives you an idea of just kind of where we're sitting right now. So he said, it's very likely we're going to see non-revenue sports get massacred. Title IX is something, or is going to be a very big battle. How are you going to stop it? It's going to be very tough. So just to give you an idea of where we're at, it's kind of, college sports has been at a place where everything is so confusing, everything's all over the place for so long, that you've kind of had to work backwards. You've had to make up ground for where you kind of lost it in the first little bit of NIL and all of this type of stuff, with the NCAA kind of dragging its feet a little bit. Ground needs to be made up, and the way you do that, honestly, is kind of cutting corners. So college football is safe. There's no question about that. They are self-sustainable. College basketball is likely safe, just because they are one of the other revenue sharing or revenue making sports in a lot of these different athletic departments. Baseball is kind of on the edge there, but every single other sport is going to be worried year over year about this new kind of setup they have and the new way of things, because more money that goes out the door in revenue sharing and in contracts and everything that is to come for athletic departments, the less there is for these non-revenue sharing sports. And then you have to sit down and have a question and say, is it worth keeping, let's just say swimming, or swimming and diving. Is it worth keeping that sport when it's not bringing in money, where we could allocate that money to football and basketball and the sports that are bringing in money? And that's a conversation I'm sure that has been happening across athletic departments for a very long time. But the reality is, haven't necessarily gotten to the point where you need to pull that trigger. You need to make that hard decision, but that time could come very soon, especially with all of the changes going on, and especially if you get into a revenue sharing employment type model, things get a little bit more sketchy for those smaller non-revenue creating sports. So it's going to be really, really interesting to watch. But the biggest thing that we kind of talked about last week a little bit is the Players Association of this all. What does this look like, and kind of how can we get players a seat at the table? Because that's the most important thing, I think, in this conversation. Is if you're going to have a conversation about how, you're going to handle kids being paid and being compensated at the college football and college sports level, them not being in on those conversations is outright ridiculous. So we talked about in last week athletes.org, which was a new kind of players association that was set up, and the UAB team has signed with them. The football team, the first Division I football team to fully sign with them. They have 3,000 active members. I was not sure when I was talking about this just how big of an organization it was. They have 1,500 guys from power conferences, he says. There are so many things going into this, and there's so many different ways to kind of look at this, but it looks like that athletes.org, or AO, as you'll see it kind of referred to in a lot of these articles, will hit critical mass, and as they say, with 50% of all athletes in power conferences within the next year. So they fully expect this to be a continually growing thing, and not necessarily something that is a blip on the radar by any means. So this is huge. It's something that is absolutely something that needs to happen. I don't think there's any question about that, just because when you're in a situation where you're being employed by someone, especially if you're someone that is, 18 to 22 years old, and a lot of this goes a little bit over your head, you want to be at the table. Now, here's the very, very interesting report that I heard from Pete Thamel this morning, that it sounds like this group of people, the College Football Players Association more specifically, is less interested in employment than we once thought, or we once assumed, I think. I think a lot of us thought that that was just kind of going to be the way of things. We were going to get into that realm, and players are going to be more than fine with that. It sounds like they'd rather have a collective bargaining agreement, but not full-time employment. So they're trying to figure out kind of a hybrid there. We'll figure out what happens there. But there's another interesting quote that came out from Charlie Baker, the president of the NCAA, when he was talking about employment and talking about the future of college football. He said, if you convert all college football into employment, there's simply no doubt based on the math that you'll lose an enormous number of student-athlete opportunities across all three divisions, because the money is not there. Most schools lose money on sports, even in D1. So it's something that we talked about with baseball and basketball. Those are the ones that bring in money. The rest of them essentially lose money every single year, outside of some very, very special circumstances. So it gives you an idea that not everyone can do this. That's just the reality of the situation. $15 to $25 million is not an easy thing to do for the vast majority of schools. I mean, more than 50% of Group of 5 schools earn less than $40 million annually in revenue. So if $25 million of that is going straight out the door, you got a bigger problem on your hands, and you got some really tough decisions to make. So, and just to put that in comparison to some other schools, Ohio State brought in about $251.6 million in revenue last year. So there's a gap, and they need to be handled separately. And it's something that Jeffrey Kessler, the lead attorney on this case, has kind of talked about a lot. He says you have to look at the Power Five differently than the Group of Five and other schools just because they're different. They sit on different thrones when it comes to the financial burden on some of these programs compared to the others. So Ohio State can throw that money out the window and have no problem with it. Troy probably can't. So you're going to have some tough conversations, and this is going to be a monumental domino to fall. It's going to be something that's going to be really interesting to watch. Marcelo did go into kind of what congressional help could do with this, could definitely streamline everything. But as I've said in the past, I would be pretty skeptical if they were to get in, that they will get in the next little bit. Especially in a election year and things of that nature. I think it's more likely that we have to wait a little bit if Congress wants to get involved, but it feels like things are starting to happen, right? This is a huge domino. I've said it before, and I'll say it, probably a number of other times. This might be the most consequential thing going on in college sports right now. It might be the most important thing for the future of college sports in quite some time. So this is going to be huge. It feels like that domino is starting to tilt a little bit, and we might have it fall pretty soon. The aftermath is going to be a little bit messy, and we'll get into that a little bit more in the next segment because a little bit more mess might be added to this. But overall, if you're a college football fan and only a college football fan, you don't really need to worry about this. Your teams will be fine. Now, if you're a Group of Five or a smaller school fan, you might want to be a little bit worried. I'll be totally honest with you. But I think if you're, a fan of the big boys, if you're a fan of only the Power Five schools and only football, no worries. If you're the vast majority of college football and sports fans, I would assume, you like every sport. And it's very, very frustrating to watch some of them fall by the wayside. But I guess it's the cost of doing business at this point. So it'll be really interesting to watch all of this unfold. You very much hope that these smaller sports do not fall by the wayside, but it feels like we're heading that direction. Just how quickly will we get there is the big question. But we're going to take our first break, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about the confusion around college football. It sounds like there's an idea out there for more bowl games to be added, so let's get into that and then just kind of what the postseason could look like going forward, because there's a lot of questions, no doubt about that. So stick with us, and we will be right back with that.